Hi, this is Red G. York, and this is a learning exercise on Introduction to Human Service Management. We're talking about only a few of what I would call fundamental things about management that you should understand when you're trying to understand something about how human service organizations are managed. At the completion of this module, you'll be able to, first of all, describe the nature of the nonprofit organization. You should be able to identify your broad preferences for style of organizational management, identify 5 bases on which the nonprofit agency is held accountable to others, and identify the critical questions to be addressed in the determination of the success of the nonprofit organization. So you might want to stop and look over this for just a moment. Hit the pause screen if you want to, and look it over to get an idea of what this lesson, this fundamental lesson about the fundamentals of management is all about. I would say there are 3 types of organizations. There is the profit organization, which is the organization that can make a profit, meaning excess of income over expenses, that can be distributed to the members, and this would be, in the case of a corporation, the stockholders. That's one type of organization in which human services are sometimes delivered. The public organization is one that's run by some branch of the government. The nonprofit is a private organization that cannot make a profit to be distributed. They are recognized as exempt from the income taxes by Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. I'm giving you the 501c3 thing now because very often people will refer to a nonprofit organization simply as a 501c3 organization. So that's a number you might want to keep in your mind. So we've got 3 different types that are where human services are delivered. A question I pose: what happens if a nonprofit organization has more income than expenses? Does it have a profit, or does it have income that must be distributed to a given expense? Well, it does not have a profit. You might have figured that out already because it's called non-profit. In fact, whatever income it has to be distributed in some way to some item in the budget, which could be carryover funds for the next year or whatever, but it has to be there. It cannot be considered a profit to be given, for example, to the board members of the organization. What must all nonprofits have? One is articles of incorporation. One is an organizational structure of some kind. Another is rules or bylaws, which govern the organization's basic operation in many ways. And they normally have a board of directors which has officers. So these are some of the things you will have to have if you are a nonprofit organization. The above kinds of things rule the organization. Let me ask you this question: which has more legal authority, the preferences of the executive or the bylaws of the organization? Well, in terms of legal authority, it is the bylaws. The preferences of the executive are not written into law as having any major kind of authority, but the bylaws are. How about the board of directors or the staff? Who has more legal authority? I'm not talking about influence over things, but I'm talking about legal authority. Well, it's the board of directors who has more legal authority. The role of nonprofit organizations, let's look at that for a moment. Our society has increasingly turned to the nonprofit agency for the delivery of various mental health and social services. Several decades ago, it was the public sector that delivered the vast majority of mental health services, for example, and other kinds of human services. Now it's more likely the nonprofit sector, meaning the nonprofit sector provides more human services than either the public or the profit. The profit sector is growing. I'd say the profit sector is growing faster. A lot of things have happened in recent years in regard to the profit sector taking over human services. Sometimes they seem to be successful, sometimes not. my opinion, the jury is out as to whether this is a good trend or not. Generally, I'm not wild about it, to be honest with you. What kind of organization do we have? Let's think about several different ways to present this. This is not new with me, but there's literature suggesting that we could consider organizations to be either executive-centered, staff-centered, or client-centered. If it's executive-centered, it's what will please the executive that fundamentally drives everything. If it's staff-centered, the staff has a lot of power. So what the staff wants often determines decisions. If it's client-centered, it's meeting client needs that is the focus of attention. If you look at these three, of course, you could imagine, well, which one would seem best? Well, I would certainly advocate for the client-centered. And I would say that the ethics of the social work profession would dictate that that's really what human service organizations should be. They should be client-centered. They should be focusing on meeting client need, not the needs of the executive director or the needs of the staff, but instead the clients. Let's talk a little bit about what client-centered means. It means, first of all, focusing on client outcome. Are we achieving the client's objectives? Are we meeting the client's needs? Another aspect of that would be asking clients for feedback. Also asking, what does this mean for clients when a staff member suggests a change? So we're talking about a lot of focus on the client. It also means, of course, showing respect for clients. So is it any of these four or all of the above? Of course, all of the above is the answer there. What forces tend to push the agency to be executive-centered, staff-centered, or client-centered? What if the agency has a strong union? Would that tend to make it more likely to be executive-centered, staff-centered, or client-centered? I would say a strong union would tend to focus it on being more staff-centered. Number two, what if the agency is in high competition with other agencies for clients in order to survive? Well, that would make them more client-centered, I would say. You've got to meet the needs of clients or you'll lose clients and you won't survive. What if the executive has a cozy relationship with the board? That, of course, would tend to promote the power of the executive and tend to push the organization toward being more executive-centered. Ask you a couple more questions. What kind of agency is more likely to have clinic hours on nights or weekends? Is it client-centered, executive-centered, or staff-centered? I would say client-centered. How about asking for client feedback and taking it seriously? Client-centered, of course. What kind of nonprofit manager is better? Let's look at this particular question. Who would primarily, first of all, one who primarily identifies with those higher on the, This is a question. Would it be one who primarily identifies with those higher on the chart, or one who primarily is concerned about those lower on the chart, or one who recognizes that she must be the negotiator between those above and below? What do you think? Who would normally be the better nonprofit manager in the long run? I would say the last one who recognizes that he or she must be the negotiator between those above and those below. Accountability, of course, is a big issue. Let's talk about it in a couple of different ways. Fiduciary is a term that refers to maintaining the public trust through adherence to laws and fiscal responsibility. Another focus of accountability could be activities, and how much do we deliver? Another could be quality. Do we employ good standards of practice? That's usually what we talk about when we're talking about quality, although quality means a lot of different things to different people. I tend to use the word quality to refer to good standards of practice, like whether your staff have the proper credentials to do their job, and so forth. Outcome, achieving client goals, is another focus of accountability. Increasingly, human service organizations are called upon to be accountable on the basis of client outcome. Efficiency, something we haven't talked a lot about in recent years, but it's improving in its focus, and that is using resources optimally. How much are you getting for the money? How much service to deliver per dollar, and so forth. Here's some critical questions. How should I, as executive director, help the board do its job best? The good executive director provides the board with the information they need to do their job best, and not information that the executive finds would help the executive to get what he or she wants, but instead help the board to do its job best. How do we deliver programs that are effective and financially supported? Another major question that is something that the executive and the staff should be focused upon, and the board for that matter as well. How do we promote good leadership? And how do we make optimal decisions for the mission of the organization? So decision-making and leadership clearly are two major things that are important for the functioning of the human service organization. I'm going to do a summary. This is part one of the summary of what we've just gone over. Non-profit agencies are private organizations that serve a public purpose, cannot make a profit to be distributed to members, and are governed by a board and bylaws. Human service agencies can be executive-centered, client-centered, or staff-centered. Preferably it's staff-centered. Preferably it's client-centered. Part two of summary. Certain circumstances tend to push the agency toward being executive-centered or client-centered or staff-centered, as we have talked. Another point, the critical questions that show the potential for success of the human service organization are related to board performance, leadership, accountability, decision-making, and program development. This is the end of the presentation. I hope this is helpful to you.